Okay, so this video is going to be a little bit different because it comes not from Olaf's camera or from my camera, it comes from Jana Dagdagan's camera. And this video came about because she and I were chatting on the phone about 6 months ago, and I'd said, you know who is reaching more new people with his hi-fi system exhibitions than any hi-fi show on the planet? Devon Turnbull. So Jana asked me if I'd be interested in a video interview with Devon Turnbull. After all, she and Turnbull are based in the New York area and I'm not. So yeah, absolutely, damn straight I would be interested in hearing what Devon Turnbull has to say about hi-fi. So in September, Jana took her camera gear, her microphone gear to set up an interview with Devon Turnbull at his New York Soho showroom, which I think is on the back of the USM showroom. And she asked him about his recent collaborations with Denon and Klipsch. But the conversation starts with Turnbull explaining how his OJAS brand came to life.
This episode is brought to you by AudioQuest. With products to fill every need and prices to suit every budget, AudioQuest is made for you. Visit AudioQuest.com for more information.
My name's Devon Turnbull. I'm an artist and an audio product designer. I operate a boutique audio business called OJAS, and a lot of people experience my work in fine art galleries and museums around the world. We're here in my showroom. It's a space I'm super fortunate to have in Soho, New York City, where I'm able to share my work with people. What I do is tricky. I never quite know how to answer what I do. I was watching my friend Gary Huswitz's Brian Eno documentary yesterday, and I really identified with he's also, when he talks about what he does as a music producer, he's always like, I don't know exactly what I'm doing. And even they had David Bowie, so what does Brian Eno do? And he was like, I get really uncomfortable when people ask me that because I don't really know what he does, but he produced some of his biggest records, So it's hard for me to say in a sentence what I do. But I'm developing audio products, oftentimes just one-off things that I'll make that are one of a kind, and sometimes they're a success, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they end up in an exhibition in a museum or a gallery. Sometimes I'm developing things that we make in sort of small run boutique manufacturing in my workshop in Brooklyn. And sometimes recently, in cases like the Denon collaboration and the Klipsch collaboration, they are produced in a more conventional way, and they're available more like a conventional audio product. Yeah, my path to where I am right now is just it was very organic. I started through just kind of being a music lover and sort of audio geek from a really early age. I was the kid in high school who set up the stereo system to throw parties. I had sort of an assembled hi-fi system in my bedroom that was all kind of hand-me-downs and thrift store picks and stuff like that. So that's kind of going back really as far as I can remember. I was a keyboard player. That was my instrument when I was a kid that my parents had me in lessons with. So even just in doing that, I had a Hafler install amp and a pair of old Pioneer speakers. I don't even really know where they came from. So I had a system for as long as I can remember. And then I went to school in Seattle. I was in an audio engineering program. So I was kind of on track to work in music studios, recording and touring and stuff like that. After I finished that program, I kind of just like through opportunity and circumstance started doing visual art stuff, even though I had no formal training in art or design at all. But I was doing some visual art stuff just kind of for fun. And I guess I just kind of got some like traction with that stuff. A lot of my interest in audio stemmed from like having relationships with artists that I aspired to kind of have friendships or working relationships with. And I found that like through communicating my visual art, it was actually like I was finding those inroads that way. So for about a decade, I had a career that was purely like visual art, design, art direction, creative direction. I had a menswear brand, so I designed clothing, I designed graphics, I designed magazine layouts, books, and products. I think I was thinking kind of too narrowly about creative identity at the time. I was a bit like embarrassed that I didn't study visual art or design in school, so I kind of like almost hid that part of my identity that was my education, because my education seemed unrelated to my career. I stopped working in pro audio, I stopped DJing, and my relationship to music changed so that listening to music at home was a really important part of my like creative process. And I wanted to have much more personal, deeper relationships with the music and the artists that inspired me. So I started just kind of assembling a system, buying kind of like entry-level high-end gear that I could afford. And I was working in Tokyo. I had a studio there. That's where we sampled and produced all the clothing that we were making. So I was spending a couple months a year in Tokyo. And I got exposed to like the Japanese perspective on hi-fi, which is quite different than like Western high-end audio. Especially back then. Now I think a lot of these concepts are becoming a bit more mainstream. People are getting into triodes and high-efficiency speakers and things like that. But at the time, there was very little of that here in the U.S. And some friends of mine were buying some really expensive high-end gear of that kind. And I couldn't afford that stuff. But I did, in kind of looking at it and considering it, feel that I could, just make my own version of a lot of those things. My exposure to DIY culture in Japan was also quite revelatory, because it was a place where self-built equipment is generally kind of considered to be on a higher level than, a lot of manufactured audio gear, because they have an incredible boutique parts market. Parts that are so expensive that no manufacturer will use them in like a manufactured equipment. So, I think that the general attitude about DIY there is just so different than it was here, and probably still is here, which has a stigma of like, oh, you can't afford, which I did say was part of my kind of process, but just that, DIY in Japan is like a very respected and kind of elevated form of system building, as opposed to here, where like I would come back to New York and want to go have a dialogue with, someone in a hi-fi shop about something that I'd heard or something that I was interested in making, and it was just like kind of shut that down right away, So I started with a few projects, I built a single-ended 2A3 amp, and I kind of deconstructed and reconstructed like an Altec-based 2A small speaker and a Garrard 301 turntable. And that was sort of my first set of projects. And this is in the early 2000s. So, about 20 years ago, I had my first kind of like system where I felt like there's a bit of my hand in the sound. And although I was, I think, still developing like my character and like what my sound was, that was kind of when I started down that path. And I was still working professionally in like visual art and design. And I just considered this like my personal practice. Like this is what I do to kind of like relax and, exercise my creative energy in a way that's not like work, which I really liked. And I wanted to maintain that. I really had no aspirations of like doing anything in the field of audio for recognition or, for purposes of having like a business or anything like that. Just at the time also, it was quite hard for me to find people that were like interested in this craft. I would tell friends of mine, peers, they'd want to talk about, particularly I had really sort of fallen out of love with like the clothing industry. That whole business model for me was like something that I was kind of stuck in but not satisfied with creatively at all. And so I just had no interest in discussing that with friends. And then when I kind of would pivot to like, I'm really into like all this audio stuff I'm building. And, I just want to talk about like a single-ended amp circuit. And, most of my friends were just like, we don't understand, we don't know what you're talking about. Like they were just kind of, okay, cool. Anyway, like back to whatever we're talking about. But slowly but surely, I would find interested people that would kind of start to want to participate in the craft and the hobby with me. And then over time, people asked me to help them making unique things that they wanted that were maybe similar to something that I was making. And I started doing commissions like one at a time. I'd have kind of maybe one project every 2 years. And then I'd have like a couple projects 1 year. And then, it was still very boutique. I wasn't even like small scale manufacturing anything. But I did have some like regular clients that were quite influential. So like there was a little bit of awareness of what I was doing. I had, just to kind of speak in terms of like metrics, like my Instagram following at the time was maybe 10,000 followers or something like that, which felt like a lot to me at the time. And then during COVID, during like the kind of first major lockdown in the pandemic, I had this idea, it was a major like DIY moment, right? Like everyone's like baking bread and doing puzzles and like just people had a lot of time on their hands. And people who had absolutely no interest in baking were all of a sudden like making bread and stuff like that. And I just kind of had this thought like, well, making stuff is like what I do. And like, why wouldn't I just kind of lean into my practice as like a home crafter of audio gear? I did an Instagram post one day, just sitting on my stoop in like the first month of the lockdown. And I just said like, would anyone be interested in like building their own speakers? Like maybe we could get a little Zoom group together. If we could get like 5 or 10 people to do like speaker building as a group in like a Zoom, that would be cool. And the response was like insane. It was like hundreds of people sending me messages like, I really want to do this. So Virgil Abloh, who was like a really important figure in the creative world and was a very close friend of mine and frequent collaborator and kind of patron, called me up that night and was like, let's do it. Let's do the speaker kit, do it on my website, on Canary Yellow, which is like his personal e-com site, basically. So we wound up building like a sub-site for OJAS, my brand, and we started by pre-selling these speaker kits of a small speaker, coaxial, 8-inch coaxial speaker that I'd been working on. And we pre-sold them, not having really we made maybe one prototype. And I think we just had it live for like a day or two, turned it off, we'd sold something like 60 speaker kits, which seemed like a lot, and it was a lot because it took us like 2 months to make all those kits and pack them and ship them to everyone. But that was like a major inflection point where, I started getting a lot more interest in what I was doing and awareness of my, audio practice, which is, it's hard to really define what that is, started growing. And then, a few years later, I was invited by an incredible art gallery in New York called Listen Gallery, not Listen Gallery. I know that confuses a lot of people because I'm the only like audio-related artist that they exhibit. It's Lisson Gallery. Their original gallery in London is on Listen Street. But they invited me to exhibit like a listening room, like a more minimalistic version of this in the gallery. I had a listening room at home, and I think a lot of what people knew about me and my practice was just through like little clips online that they'd seen of this listening room I had at home. Herb featured it in Stereophile around that time as well. But it was in my home. A lot of people were interested in kind of like experiencing that room, but given that it was in my home, I could only have so many like house guests. And so one of those house guests was the owner of this gallery, and he sort of, I think, just recognized that in building this equipment, I was really approaching it with the same, kind of with the same level of like integrity and intention as any of the artists they were exhibiting in the gallery. And he was like, why don't we try exhibiting this like as an artwork in the gallery? That was the summer of 2022. It was also something that like, I just didn't know how this would go. It wasn't something that I set out to do. I was never like, oh, I want to start making audio. I wasn't like an artist that was like, I've got a cool art idea. I'm going to make like a stereo system. It's not like conceptual art in that way. I guess you could say it's like, kind of outsider art in that I'm just someone making something that's been contextualized as artwork. And that as an art practice has grown in an interesting, organic way that I think is still really developing, that I don't really know exactly what it'll look like in another few years. But I built this system. Every piece in the show was built just for that system, for that show. It was all unique at the time. And I was very insecure about like how it would be received. Because, there was, every time I do one of these shows, I kind of put myself in a position where I sort of challenge myself and my technical abilities to be able to put together that particular system. And I treat each one as like an evolutionary step. So there's always something experimental in each system. So I'm never quite sure like if on day one I'll like really feel like it's a good representation of what I hope it will be, because I don't have a space to like set all this stuff up in and properly listen to it the way I will in the gallery. they're always bigger than I have enough space for in my studio. I got it all set up a few days before the show opened, and after, you know, a day of tuning, I thought, okay, I'm very happy with this. Like, I'm not embarrassed by this. So I then started to like talk about it just a couple of days before the show opened, and the reception was like incredible, and I couldn't believe how many people came to see the show at the opening, and then that only grew throughout the course of the show. A lot of the press around the Klipsch thing, I've been noticing, they refer to as like the Devon Turnbull or OJAS like phenomenon, which is something that I take a little bit of offense to, because it's sort of implying that it's like some freakish thing has happened. And I mean, to an extent, I agree, but I also find it a little bit like, derogatory when someone's like, oh, the phenomenon of like, maybe I shouldn't, but I will admit that it is a bit of a phenomenon, and that's sort of where that sort of started, where these listening room presentations in art museums and art galleries, most notably the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art last summer. I'll admit that as much as anyone else, I'm kind of just like astonished by how many people come and connect with the work and tell me how powerful it is for them. It's not something that I really did not foresee that. So it is a phenomenon in a way. And I guess that first show at Listen Gallery is sort of where that started to take form. So going back to that first amp that I built, it was like very informed by sound practices. I discovered sound practices right around the time they stopped publishing. If you're not familiar with sound practices was a magazine that a guy named Joe Roberts was the editor and publisher of for about 10 years. I'm not sure, don't quote me on that, but it was sort of like a mostly 90s era kind of underground audio publication that also sort of celebrated this philosophy, which I would kind of broadly refer to as like the Japanese perspective on audio, this kind of single-ended triode, high-efficiency speaker philosophy. Now, that's not like all that I do. I think that's also another misconception about like, you know, what I'm about. Because I also build, you know, nightclub sound systems and work with like a lot of fairly conventional pro audio gear. And then now some of the listening systems that I'm building to are also like a hybrid and break a lot of rules that exist within those philosophies. So the system I had at the SF MoMA had a DSP in it and, you know, had multiple Class D amps running in parallel with a single-ended 211 amp. So a lot of people have kind of influenced me and informed my work along the way. But that first project, like I said, was very informed by reading sound practices and also specifically the work of a guy named Joseph S. Mila. He's a super awesome guy. He does a really good job of like documenting his work as primarily a DIYer. He was a contributor to sound practices. He'll always publish like his circuits, and as like all the Japanese builders do too. They'll build something. They'll publish the project in MJ usually, which is big. MJ or Stereo Sound, which are the two big audio magazines in Japan. You know, sort of studying circuits from MJ, communicating a bit with Joseph, and really like having admiration for like a group of builders here in New York that were all still kind of around at that time, but I was a bit too like timid to approach a lot of them. Now they're friends of mine, but you know, Herb is one of those guys. J.C. Morrison, Don Garber, who's not with us anymore, and I actually did not know. Komuro, who's designing amps with John DeVore now, and a handful of other guys that really contributed to a community of people making this kind of stuff one generation before me here in New York. So there's that, and then I had a mentor in Japan, this guy, Koji Wakabayashi, who had a business called Eiffel. Pretty early on, I had been buying parts from Koji. He, at the time, had sort of a warehouse set up in, I think, Yokohama somewhere, where he represented GIP Labs, which is widely regarded as like the best Western Electric reproduction company. Now they also make some other things that are not just straight Western Electric reproductions, but they're kind of like at the pinnacle of the Western Electric school, if you will. So he represented GIP Labs. He sold a lot of boutique Japanese parts internationally, and also sold some American parts in Japan, like MagnaQuest transformers, very revered. Well, the Mike Lefevre version of MagnaQuest, which was, not the original MagnaQuest transformers, but there was a guy in, I believe, DC or Baltimore that had like the original winding machines and stuff like that. He was making MagnaQuest transformers. Koji was a distributor of his and sold a lot of like books and magazines and things like that. So I had been buying and selling, or really just buying things from Koji for years. And then I think around 2007, I think it was 2007 or so, Koji told me he had moved to Fukushima and he was building an audio museum. And I was going to be in Japan like the next month or something. And I said, oh, man, this sounds amazing. I'd love to come and visit you. Not realizing like that it was so far from Tokyo or anything. I'd never met him in person. He was, already like pretty old, could speak English, which is great. But, and I just had this kind of life-changing experience where he invited me to come visit him, took the Shinkansen for like a couple hours up to Fukushima, took a small, like local train up this mountain, Mount Bandai-san, this volcanic lake that he had bought a hotel on. And that's where he was kind of setting up this crazy, incredible like collection of gear, and which was supposed to eventually become a museum. I don't think it ever really turned into anything like a museum. He unfortunately passed away a couple years ago. I have a lot of things that I sort of inherited from him, but that was a super like life-changing experience. Not really because of like any one technical thing that I learned from Koji while I spent time there. That first experience was really more just about he treated audio, it was his lifestyle, and the way it like looked and felt and sounded was just something that I wanted to kind of emulate in my life, which was like this as a central practice for my life. Like, kind of just a level of like obsessive pursuit of learning and experimenting and just enjoying was something that I took away from that experience. And then I also should mention a few other people who continue to be an important part of my practice. Another sound practices contributor, Steve Berger, who's a guy here in New York that a lot of people know of as a great builder of a lot of this kind of gear. So Steve and I are kind of collaborating every day. He's sort of on the tube circuit stuff. He's sort of like my main collaborator. And also my friend Merwin Andrade. We do a lot of he kind of consults on a lot of speaker design stuff. He's another very close old friend actually from the fashion world who has been participating in this kind of craft and hobby for many decades as well. So these guys are, I have a lot of great mentors, but through also now working in pro audio, kind of going back to, in a way, like my roots in pro audio, building nightclub sound systems, I think there are a lot of things that I'm doing that, like I don't have any one I don't have any one person who kind of philosophically is like guiding what I'm doing. There's a lot of experimentation that's part of the process. So I'm sitting next to the Klipsch OJAS KO-R1, which is the first collaboration between Klipsch and me. K stands for Klipsch, O stands for OJAS, R stands for Rebel, which refers to, has a backstory within the culture of Klipsch. But I usually just use kind of abbreviation, serial number style nomenclature for all my products. So we just refer to it as the KO-R1. It started with the Heresy as a kind of a platform for collaboration. It uses a cast aluminum horn that I produced and sent to them in Hope. It's a high density birch plywood cabinet as opposed to MDF. It's a two-way instead of a three-way, so the speaker is kind of simplified, and I think we gain a lot of coherence in the mids and highs by not having an additional crossover from a compression driver to a tweeter. It has selectable attenuation on the HF, and yeah, I'm really proud of what we made together. That's another opportunity that I feel really lucky to have. My work has a level of visibility that I think is attractive to audio brands, but it's so countercultural in the current mass market audio market that I think that a lot of big audio brands really don't understand how countercultural it is. So I get approached by a lot of audio brands to work together, but a lot of them, there's really just no overlap between what I do and what they do philosophically. So although maybe we both make speakers, a collaboration between me and most mainstream audio brands just doesn't make sense because you can't stretch what I do and what they do far enough for there to really be any kind of common ground for us to make something on. So I've said no to a lot of requests for sort of collaboration from bigger audio companies, even though a lot of them could be very lucrative. They could be very rewarding in that way, but they just don't make sense to me. They're not something that I think is worth pursuing. But I got just a random Instagram DM from this guy, Vinny, who's the COO and president of Klipsch at Premium Audio Group, and just kind of saying look, I follow what you're doing. I think it's really cool. Would you be interested in working with Klipsch in some capacity? And that was one where I just said okay, well, this is completely different. This is actually a brand that I have a lot of alignment with philosophically. And first and foremost, just to be able to work with their team and go to Hope and see how a real mature speaker manufacturer works was super exciting to me. So, I agreed to, discuss what that could look like. And they said, okay, great. We're glad you're on board, but next we've got to get Roy on board. Roy Delgado is their sort of CTO. He's the top technical person who studied under Paul Klipsch, Mr. K as they call him, and is sort of he's what they described to me as like the most important person in terms of if Roy's excited about the project, it'll turn out great. If Roy's not interested in the project fundamentally, then like it just won't work. So it's great that we've got you on board. Now we've just got to work on Roy. So I gave them sort of like a list of like what the way I would approach a first project. I liked the idea of working with the Heresy as a kind of a platform for collaboration. The Heresy, it kind of lives in a category of its own in terms of the size of the speaker and its efficiency. And so it's often sort of an entry into high efficiency for people that are interested in exploring like low power amplification, high efficiency speaker. It's the right size for a lot of people sort of starting out in that world. And I had heard the latest iteration, the Heresy 4, and I thought like, that's something that I would kind of like to like deconstruct, reconsider, and make my own version of. So I kind of gave them like a list of things that I'd be interested in doing to the speaker, reducing it from a 3-way to a 2-way, having a selectable attenuation of the HF driver, using a horn that I would produce, and really just kind of simplifying the speaker in ways that I thought would be beneficial sonically. And so they went back to Roy. He hadn't heard of me. He didn't know, he didn't really have much context other than like, we're interested in working with this guy. Here's some of his work, and here are some of his like ideas, sort of as a starting point. And he was just like, yeah, I mean, this is all stuff that I would love to do anyway. That I think if we can sort of break script with like what we have to do in terms of this heritage line being true to the original Klipsch models that they're continuing to reproduce and iterate. Having someone come in, I think, with an outsider's perspective and do things that are in subtle ways radically different than what they're already doing was like very exciting to him. So we were kind of like off to the races. I went down to Hope and had a sort of a prototyping, exploratory engineering session with their team down there. Super inspiring place. It's the original facility that Paul Klipsch had been building since the 50s. So it's, I mean, I'm sure the longest standing, like dedicated speaker factory, I don't know if in the world, but certainly in the United States. And the culture there, the capabilities, all of it is just like super inspiring to spend time there. And we started developing the speaker. So this is the Denon OJAS DL103O. This is a version of the DL103R, which is a cartridge that I've been using since it was my first moving coil cartridge that I had, and something I've come back to for the last 20 years. Unlike the collaboration with Klipsch, we developed a very unique product that I think is so different from the platform we started with that it's really, you couldn't call this a version of a Heresy. This, on the other hand, is mechanically exactly the same as a DL103R. But what I wanted to do was showcase the craftsmanship that goes into all these beautiful handmade cartridges by making the body clear, and also just going to the factory in Shirakawa. It's actually hard to call it a factory. They call it the cartridge studio, where there are just two people that make every single DL103, every version of it, by hand. And just witnessing that process is super inspiring. I wouldn't venture to think that I could tell them how to make this cartridge better, because it's pretty perfect in my opinion. So what I really wanted to do is just more storytelling around how the cartridge is made and the individual components that make up the cartridge. And by making the body clear, you can clearly see the magnet, the pull pieces, all of the parts that make up the cartridge. I'm definitely one of those people that, like, when you ask them what kind of music do you listen to, they say like everything, and it is just my honest answer. You know, I cannot think of like a genre of music that I have not one example of something I appreciate. But yeah, I listen to a little bit of everything. But of course, building hi-fi gear informs not just the way you listen to music, but the music you listen to, I think, in a really positive way. You know, building gear that sounds really natural. Of course, you're attracted to a lot of acoustic music where there is the sound of a real instrument that you want to at least appreciate for the like subtle beauty that is that specific instrument. So, you know, I listen to a lot of classical, you know, art music, new classical, whatever you want to call, sort of like avant-garde classical music. Jazz, classic jazz, you know, and also a lot of new jazz that blends concepts from jazz and electronic music is kind of increasingly something that I listen to. My starting point for this is like the classic Altec two-way speaker really excels at very mid-range forward music. The speaker just doesn't have frequency extremes. You don't get very much high, you don't get very much deep bass. So, you know, real instruments, very kind of unproduced recordings, they can sound really lifelike and textural and beautiful and dynamic. But then when you play, you know, something which is maybe produced more recently, especially stuff that uses like synth bass or electronic production, you need more low end than you get from that speaker. So a big sort of part of my developing my sound has been finding ways to incorporate subwoofers and super tweeters to get those frequency extremes without like detracting from the experience, that kind of pure experience that you have of this really beautiful mid-range that, you know, people like me generally think of as being like a really special textural kind of sound. You know, that's kind of led me to look for high efficiency bass solutions. And then also learning over time how to incorporate them well, you know, with phase alignment and general things we can do these days with DSP that can get the bass to sound really coherent and natural with the mid bass. So that's been a big part of my kind of evolution of my gear and my music taste as well. And, you know, I'm just really fortunate in that my audio practice has allowed me to now start collaborating with a lot of the artists that I listen to. So, I mean, that's by far the coolest part of like this whole practice and where it's taken me. to what is admittedly just like a really kind of unbelievable place these days. But it's being able to collaborate with artists like Andre 3000 and Nala Sinephro, and even if that's just giving them a platform to share their music with people, and sometimes a deeper level of collaboration that can involve recording and playback, and just a platform to share music on. And over time, my music direction has become like a bigger and bigger part of my practice, which isn't something that I originally really thought would happen. But I think that people have kind of come to consider me sort of like I don't know about a spokesperson, but I think over time people have come to consider me someone who is able to share avant-garde music with like broader culture, people who maybe aren't otherwise discovering that music. So in a way, I've also become kind of like a DJ that can influence music trends by playing music, even though I never even thought like playing music would necessarily be part of what people thought of as like my practice. As an example, this incredible young artist from London named Nala Sinephro, she plays the harp and synthesizers, and I guess she's a sort of a composer and band leader. Her first record, which is called Space 1.8, was on Warp Records, which is an electronic music label. They don't typically do anything that you'd find in like a jazz section. It's a very unique sounding record because it has a real drum kit, it has a harp, it has horns, but the bass is like synth bass. So it doesn't sound exactly like jazz. It's really like like this hybrid of electronic music and jazz. And so I think at first, actually, the first couple times I listened to it, I wasn't quite sure what it was supposed to sound like, because it sounds so unique. But the sound was I was super attracted to it. And I think it really helped me develop this sound that I have, which is a lot more bass forward than a lot of people think of in a typical hi-fi system. Because this music and a lot of the jazz that I listen to is very bass forward music. So when older audiophiles come in to my listening rooms when I'm playing this kind of music, all the time I get feedback from them like, oh, there's way too much bass. It sounds boomy, or all the kind of like derogatory things that people will say when referring to usually like subwoofers. I think my bass solutions are always specifically very fast and musical sounding subs. So whether it's like the Fostex FW800HS, which is a 31.5-inch cone, it's a high efficiency driver, it's in the high 90s in terms of its efficiency, or a lot of horn-loaded or transmission line subs that I'm designing and producing in collaboration with a company in Norway called NNNN, my friend Runa. And these also don't sound like a club sub or a home theater sub, but you can get very prominent bass from them. So a lot of this kind of music, this new jazz that I'm really into, it's coming from like a generation of artists that are also like interested in electronic music and stuff that sounds maybe like a nightclub, and like coming from a tradition of jazz. Like the generation gap and split in bass taste is like a super interesting thing to talk about. I don't know if this is like the right sort of like forum for that, but I know when I'm doing these presentations, something that I'm always balancing, especially when it's somewhere as public as like the SF MoMA, where like thousands of people a week are coming, and it's going on for months on end. I get tons of feedback, tons of like unsolicited feedback. And I just know that like I'm going to, if I have the bass tuned kind of where I really like it, I will have like younger people coming in saying, I don't think the subwoofer is working. There's not enough bass. Something's off. There's not enough bass. And I'll have older people coming in saying, oh, it sounds so boomy and bassy that like, I don't like it. I exist in that Venn diagram overlap where like, I like sometimes a slightly boomy forward bass, like pronounced bass sound. But it's not, doesn't distract you from like, if you're listening to an upright bass, it still sounds like an upright bass. And if you're listening to, a synth bass, it gives you that visceral bass feeling without being overpowering. That's a big part of like the way I design systems, and also is it reflects a lot of the music that I'm listening to that kind of straddles that line. None of it is like really bass, like beat music, and most of it is not. And most of it is not like, although I do listen to a lot of like classical music, I still like, even with a pipe organ, I like to really feel those low notes of the pipe organ. And I think that that's something that, if you're talking to like someone in the field of audio equipment, is like an inevitable conversation that will eventually come up. I mean, I think that, of course, I have a level of like just visibility now that, people who don't like my work, people who are just have people that have like some preconceptions that will cause them to not agree with my philosophies or aesthetic, whether that's visual aesthetic or an auditory aesthetic, like they kind of they will come across my work, and I'll probably like hear from them. So I think like in the last 6 months, I've sort of like increasingly become in a position where I kind of just have to like deal with, oftentimes criticism that's like very baseless criticism. And my whole creative practice, and also just like my creative engine, is in so many ways informed by working with Virgil Abloh. He had to endure criticism on like a crazy level, especially because so much of his identity was on the internet, and, just comments on any of these platforms are so prevalent, and he was so good at just like deflecting and absorbing, and like just didn't seem to bother him at all, like people. And when you're a clothing designer, like it's just too easy. Anyone can be like, oh, this is like ugly, right? I mean, in audio, there's a huge amount of that as well, because there's aesthetics plays into everything in audio. And I'm not talking just about visual aesthetics, but I'm talking about like sonic aesthetics, right? Like, I mean, every brand has its own sound. I'm referring to that as an aesthetic. And I can endure, by no means, I've never been here to say like I do anything better than anyone else, that, a lot of people in audio that's kind of what they're all about, is kind of proving that they're smarter than everyone else. I am just not that way at all. Like, I have something to learn from everyone out there. And I'll be the first one to admit when someone knows more than me about something. Like I said earlier, there's nothing that I know a lot about that I can't find someone who knows more than me about. It's the overall like style that ultimately is what makes my practice my practice. And if you don't like that, that's fine. The thing that does like kind of hurt and just like I when I want to like sort of set someone straight is when they will kind of like they'll use like the word hipster. This term of like hipster is really like sort of the like derogatory catch-all for just like someone like me that kind of comes from New York City, that's partaken in like creative culture for their whole like career, and just kind of when people will try to refer to me as being like fake in some way, that's the one thing that I know for sure that I'm not, because I'm just like a super like genuine and honest person, and like there is nothing that I do that's make-believe. You know what I mean? So that's the one, I think that's the one like form of criticism that like bothers me when I see it, which is not a lot, but I can think of a couple of specific instances where like I've seen people like write that, and you know, even like I was saying with the whole kind of like referring to my practice as like a phenomenon, it also kind of like, it borders on that of like this like kind of freak thing that has happened or something like that. And again, like I'm as surprised as anyone, just given how long it took me to get people interested in this practice. I'm kind of surprised how popular it's become, but I do take a bit of offense when people think that I'm doing something as like an attention grab or something like that, because it's just not the case. If you were just like kind of tuned in at the beginning of the year and you like looked at, or even just like for the last few years, and you look at my trajectory, I have these two pretty major collaborations that I've done with big manufacturers in the last, those just come out over the course of the summer. But that does not represent like a trajectory of like, oh, now he's like doing all these collaborations with audio brands or something like that. It just so happens that like I kind of was developing both those things for literally like 2 years. And they both just kind of happened to be ready to go to market like around the same time. So like the next, I have some more collaborative things I'm working on with Klipsch. But it's not like I have like a whole roster of like other brands I'm collaborating with and like other things that I'm planning on bringing to market. I mean, when these opportunities present themselves to me and they're exciting, of course, like I enthusiastically pursue them, but I'm not like going out and saying like, I want to make, you know, headphones, like a record cleaning machine and a, you know, widget, this, that, and the other. Like I'm not looking for opportunities that I can like exploit. I'm just continuing to kind of do my thing and continue on my journey. And when opportunities present themselves that just sound like a fun thing to develop with a bigger manufacturer, I will pursue those things. But I don't have like a bunch of collaborations that are going to be coming out over the next year. I'm working on my first museum show in New York that'll be late 2025, most likely, you know, if all things go as planned. What else? I think I'll spend a lot of my time over the next year collaborating with artists, musicians specifically. I'd like to explore more like site-specific work where maybe I work with a musician to create like a unique sound system that lives in one place and plays one recording of some music played in a specific place. So I'm working on a couple projects like that. I'd like to, if I have time, I'd like to do more field recording and just kind of take more time over the next year to return to like my core creative practice of just like experimenting and enjoying the process of developing new things.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, you know what to do. And also know that Jana has a video about how Denon phono cartridges are made in Japan coming soon to her channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.